on Fleet Street and entered the quiet calm of the City of London. The financial district was bustling with people during weeknights, but at the weekends it was virtually deserted, and that suited Justine just fine. She hurried on past the huge historic buildings that still dominated this part of London: St. Paul's Cathedral, the Bank of England, the Royal Exchange, and made her way into the tangle of narrow passageways that wound their way through Cheapside. The ancient stone buildings now gave way to modern structures of steel and glass, and the porter cabins and heavy machinery of the construction sites that littered the roads at the foot of each. She turned into another alleyway, ignoring the road closed and diversion signs, and making her way towards the steel fence that had been erected at the far end. Checking that there was no one watching, Justine quickly scaled the fence, dropping nimbly onto the freshly laid tarmac on the other side. She hurried across the deserted building site, splashing through huge shallow puddles of rainwater, to where a huge pile of air conditioning ducting sat swathed in tarpaulins at the base of a towering construction crane. With one last look around to check that she hadn't been spotted, Justine lifted up the edge of the tarpaulin and ducked inside. This is where she had been sleeping for the last week. Most of the local construction sites were impossible to get into, but in the 5 nights that she had been here, Justine had only seen one elderly security guard. She assumed that there must be some delay with the construction project, as she hadn't seen a single worker, or noticed any movement or goods either in or out. Whatever the reason, she was just glad to have somewhere safe to sleep. The length of ducting wasn't warm, but at least it was dry and relatively clean. The only real downside was that she occasionally heard rats scurrying across the top of it, their claws clattering on the metal. Shrugging off her rucksack, Justine crawled further along the length of metal tube towards a bundle of blankets. They'd been handing them out at a church in Soho, and Justine had accepted a couple gratefully. The material was harsh and scratchy, not at all like the blankets on her bed at home, but at least they helped keep out the worst of the cold. Outside she could hear the rain intensifying, the tarpaulin starting to flap noisily in the wind. Shivering, she pulled the blanket tighter around her. So long since she'd slept in a proper bed. So long since she'd eaten a proper meal. So long since she'd had a shower. 3 weeks of rain and cold and rats. As if on cue, there was the clatter of claws on the metal of the ducting. A wave of despair threatened to overwhelm her. Justine had never felt so unloved and pathetic in her life. Suddenly, there was a tremendous cracking noise, like a bundle of twigs being snapped, but so loud that it shook the metal of the ducting. Instantly, Justine was on her feet, trying to work out where the sound had come from. Her heart leapt at the sound of footsteps from the yard outside, and moments later, there was the rustle of plastic as the tarpaulin covering the mouth of the ducting was pulled aside. Justine snatched up her backpack as 2 figures wearing filthy, hooded tops stepped into the tube. Oh, God! She felt herself freeze, terrified.
No need to be scared, dearie.
The leading figure's voice was rasping and hoarse.
We're not going to hurt you.
Justine backed away as the intruders started to advance along the pipe towards her.
I haven't got any money, she said quickly.
Money?
The figure gave a wheezing laugh.
It's not money we're after. Got no use for it,
chipped in the other.
It's a donation we want.
A what?
The first one giggled.
Charity begins at homeless.
Justine had heard enough. The 2 were trouble, clearly off their heads. She turned to run, knowing that there was a way out at the other end of the ducting, but as she turned, her foot caught on the hem of her blanket, and she crashed heavily to the floor. Immediately, the 2 figures pounced, gripping Justine's arms and legs. With a scream of rage, Justine kicked out, her heel catching one of her assailants on the side of the head and sending him sprawling.